Disclaimer: this story contains unhealthy relationship dynamics and other content that modern viewers might find upsetting. Listen at your own risk. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I will be reading from The Man Without a Heart by Ruby M. Ayres, and I will be continuing where we left off on Chapter 5. It was much later on in the morning that Asher came to her as she was sitting at the open front door looking into the wood. "I want you to write a letter for me." She turned. "A letter? To whom?" "To my sister." Her face paled. She rose to her feet. "To Linda," she faltered. "Yes, why not?" He saw her agitation, and it gave him a cruel pleasure. "Isn't it usual to write to your hostess after you have left her house, to thank her for her hospitality, or is that another of the customs you have disposed of?" She hesitated. Then she said quietly, "What do you wish me to say?" "If you come in, I will tell you." She followed him back into the room, and he put paper and ink on the table. "Shall I write from this address?" she asked. "You can put the name of the hotel where you intended staying. Just write an ordinary letter. You know what to say without my telling you." He held the pen to her, and Barbara sat down obediently. She dashed off a few lines and held them up for his inspection. "Will that do?" He read them carefully. "Thank you, that will do quite well. Now she will not wonder why you have not written, and nobody will worry." Barbara laughed. "If that is all your concern, the letter need not go," she said. "I have nobody in the world who will lose a moment's sleep on my account." He looked at her. "Except my worthy brother-in-law, I suppose." The color flickered into her cheeks and died down again. "Oh, Edmund, poor Edmund," she said with a note of pain in her voice. Asher's face was ugly as he turned away, the letter in his hand. I wonder if there's a decent woman to be found in the whole of England today," he said savagely. There followed 2 long days of monotony for Barbara. The momentary gleam of sunshine had faded after a few hours, and a steady downpour of rain succeeded it. Gray skies, sodden earth, and the steady drip, drip from the trees all around the little house, and wrapped it like an impenetrable veil. In spite of her attempts to establish her strange relationship with Asher on a friendly basis, he remained taciturn and almost silent, except when necessity compelled him to speak to her. And at the end of the 3rd day, Barbara began to feel that she could stand the strain of her position no longer. There was so little to do in the house once the meals were cooked and cleared away, and the hours dragged terribly. Asher spent most of his time in the ragged garden outside the house, regardless of the inclement weather. He cleaned the car and tidied the old barn which served as its temporary garage, and chopped stacks of wood until Barbara asked him with a hysterical laugh if he intended to remain there for the rest of his life. He paused for a moment and straightened his back, looking at her from beneath scowling brows. "It's something to do," he answered laconically. "One must pass the time somehow." "Is that how you feel too?" she asked. "What about me, then? Don't you think the days seem like world without end, amen, to me?" In her eagerness she came a step nearer to him, the color rising in her face. "Oh, Mr. Asher, isn't this joke played out?" she urged breathlessly. "Can't we shake hands and go back to the world? I promise you, I give you my word of honor, that I will never tell a soul, never, never, how you have treated me." Asher stooped and picked up another log. "Your word of honor," he said cuttingly. She fell back with a choked little cry. Her hands clenched. Then she laughed. After all, what did it matter? Things could not continue like this forever, even if he were mad. Surely someday somebody would make inquiries for her, and help would come. It was just a matter of being patient, just for a little longer. But she knew she was almost at the end of her tether, and that only her strong will kept her up. On the 4th morning the rain stopped, and a watery sun struggled out of the clouds. Barbara felt hope rising in her heart as she opened the front door and looked into the wet heart of the woods surrounding them. She told herself once more that the whole situation was preposterous and could not possibly be happening. Was she such a weakling that she must tamely submit to the will of this man? As she moved about preparing breakfast, her thoughts were busy with her endless scheming and plotting. They could not be far from a village or a main road. She did not believe they were as isolated as Asher had declared. Sometimes, lying awake at night, she was sure she could hear the distant sound of traffic, and once the scream of a motor siren. "A penny for your thoughts, Miss Weir," Asher said at her shoulder, and she came back to the present with a start, to realize that the kettle had boiled over, and that she was standing with the empty teapot in her hand, staring out into the rugged garden. "I was dreaming," she said, a little break in her voice. "I was wondering if you would have dared to do this thing to me if I had any people of my own, who cared what became of me." He shrugged his shoulders and sat down at the table. "I thought we had done with such arguments," he said impatiently. "I thought you were reconciled." She faced him with flashing eyes. "You thought you had broken me in, you mean," she accused him. "Well, you will see." Asher spread some butter on his toast with aggravating precision. "You are threatening to run away?" he asked coolly. You mean that when I give you the opportunity, you will take it? Well, you will have... You mean that when I give you the opportunity, you will take it? Well, you will have it today." Her eyes widened with pathetic eagerness. "Today?" He went on in the same level voice. "I'm going to London this morning, and I shall not be back until late. You will have 8 or 9 hours entirely to yourself. Your jailer will be miles away, and you will be quite free to do exactly as you please." She caught her breath with a quivering sound of incredulity. "You mean that I may go?" But though she asked the question, she had no real confidence. This was some fresh scheme of his, some new game with which to torture her. "You may go if you wish, certainly," he answered. "What is there to stop you? If you follow the path opposite this house through the wood, it will take you out onto the main road 2 miles away, and the rest will be easy." She watched him with fascinated eyes. She wanted to believe him, and yet she dared not. After a moment she asked a sharp question. "And then if I go, what then?" Asher looked across the table at her. "If I come back here tonight and find you have gone," he said in a voice of flint, "I shall seek out that precious brother-in-law of mine and shoot him as I would a dog." There was a tragic silence. Barbara had gone white to the lips, and the eagerness of her eyes had changed to unutterable wariness. She knew that he spoke the truth. She knew that he would keep his word. She knew that no consideration for her, or his sister, or Edmund Hyde, would prevent him from carrying out his threat. It was, as she had thought, just a new torture which he had planned for her. Nominally, she would be free for the whole day, and she would never dare take advantage of her freedom. Asher finished his breakfast and arose to his feet. He never stood on ceremony. He did exactly as he pleased. He treated her as if she were a paid servant whose feelings he had not to consider in the slightest. "You can please yourself what you do," he said again, "but I shall keep my word." He walked out of the room, leaving her alone at the table, and she sat there for a long time, her thoughts in a whirl, burning with a resentment which she dared not show. Presently he came back. He wore his overcoat and carried his hat in his hand. Barbara looked at him. Why don't you put your hat on?" she asked mockingly. "You are not generally so respectful." He ignored her words. "I shall be back about 8, he said, and waited, but she did not speak, and he added significantly, "If you are not here," and waited again. Barbara spoke as well as her trembling lips would permit. "I shall be here." He went away through the wet woods, where the sunlight made shimmering, fantastic shadows, and she was left alone. Once Asher's presence was removed, common sense began to reassert itself in Barbara's mind. Why did she allow herself to be bullied and overruled by him? He was nothing but a brute and a coward, a braggart too, in all probability. He knew that she was afraid of him, and so made his threats. She rose presently, and mechanically began to clear away the breakfast things. She took them into the little kitchen, and put them down on the table. But further work seemed impossible. Why should she clean the house for him? Why should she do anything that he expected of her? She took her hat and went out into the wood, leaving the door of the house wide open behind her. The air was chilly after the recent heavy rain, but it was fresh and sweet, and, as she walked along, the panic and fear in her mind died away. She reminded herself that she had only to be patient for a little longer, that something must happen soon to release her from her present position. Mechanically she followed the footpath which ran away at right angles from the little house, and presently she came to the main road of which Asher had spoken, a broad, smooth road which ran into the east like a strained ribbon across a board of undulating green, dotted with dotted with clumps of bell heather. Which way did London lie, she wondered, with a dreadful feeling of homesickness, as she stood looking first to the right and then to the left. A fast car came rushing up the road, driven by a man in livery, and a wild impulse came to Barbara to stop him and tell him of her plight and beg him to take her away. Almost she had lifted her hand, then the memory of Asher's hard eyes checked her. He had meant what he said. He was not a man to make an idle threat. The car sped on, and was lost to sight over the hill. Barbara turned and went back through the wet woods to the cottage. She washed up the breakfast things and tidied the room, then hunted through her luggage for a book she had begun to read and had left unfinished, and drawing up a chair to the fire, sat down. But she could not concentrate her thoughts. They kept roaming away to the life from which Rufus Asher had cut her off so summarily. What was everyone doing, and where had Asher himself gone? The silence all around seemed almost like a living presence that was watching her with eyes of suspicion, and for the first time it occurred to her that perhaps, after all, Asher had not really gone to London, that he was somewhere close by. Perhaps even at that moment he was watching her. She put down her book and went to the window, but there was not a sound or sign of any living presence, and she laughed at herself for the thought. The cheap clock on the mantel-shelf struck 3, and she was startled to find it was so late. She had had no lunch, and she went into the kitchen to get some, more for something to do than because she was hungry. The sunshine was fading, and the sky growing overcast again. The wind was rising, and the trees were swaying agitatedly over the little house. A thrill of nervous dread went through Barbara's heart. Supposing Asher did not return that night? Supposing he left her alone through the long hours? She found herself suddenly longing for him. She would have given the world for the sound of his heavy step, or the sight of his grim and smiling face. If only he would come back! She feared him less than she feared the loneliness and silence. She ate her lunch with scant appetite, and tried to settle to the book again, but it was impossible. 4 o'clock. No ray of sunshine left now, and even the wind had dropped suddenly, as if to give place to some force greater than itself. 4 hours, perhaps more, to get through before he came back. How could she bear them? A sudden idea came to her. She would put on her hat and coat and go through the woods to meet him. Out on the main road she would not feel so lost and frightened. It was the solemnity and darkness of the woods that terrified her. She ran upstairs for her coat and was taking it down from its peg on the wall when there came a knocking on the front door below. Barbara stood still, her head turned to listen. Asher? Her thoughts leapt to the wild hope, even while she recognized its improbability. He would not knock. He knew well enough that the door would not be bolted against him. Who then could it be? She felt her heart beating up in her throat, and her hands turned cold as she crept to the head of the little staircase and peered over the rail. And then the knocking came again, louder and with more confidence, as if whoever was without suspected that the house was empty. If only she had bolted the door. In a moment perhaps the intruder would try the handle, and then she nerved herself to action. She even forced herself to hum a snatch of song as she went down the narrow staircase with as much noise as she could make, and, nerving herself to a supreme effort, opened the door. A man stood there in the fading sunlight, a short, thick-set man in a shabby overcoat, and with a cap pulled down over his eyes. He looked surprised when he saw Barbara, and after a momentary blank stare, began to speak in a mumbling, apologetic tone. "Beg pardon, lady, but I've lost my way. If you could tell me which is the road." He spoke civilly enough, and Barbara gained courage. She pointed to the footpath. "That takes you to the main road, about a mile away." And she made a movement to shut the door, but the man came a step nearer. "I haven't had anything to eat today, lady, and I was out all last night in the rain." And as he spoke, his eyes were going past her searchingly, as if to ascertain if there were other people besides in the cottage. Barbara hesitated, then she said as firmly as she could, "If you stay there, I will fetch you some food." And with a swift movement she shut the door and bolted it. Then she turned to the kitchen and was surprised to find how she was trembling. After all, the man was respectful enough, and perhaps he was really hungry. She made up a parcel of bread and cheese and some cold meat, and went back to the door, but this time she kept the chain up when she opened it, as she said, "There you are. You will find your way along the footpath quite easily," and she shut and bolted the door again. She went back to the sitting room and peered through the window, and after some moments she saw the man walking slowly away. But before he reached the bend which led into the heart of the wood, he turned back But before he reached the bend, which led into the heart of the wood, he turned and looked back at the house with a queer, searching expression in his eyes that turned her cold. She went the round of the little house after that, shutting all the windows and doors, and pulling the curtains, although it was still quite light. Then she made up the fire into a roaring blaze and sat down beside it. But her strained nerves imagined footsteps in the wood at every moment, and the sound of that muffled knocking on the outer door. She did not dare to go to meet Asher, but every nerve seemed strained to him in a passionate prayer to come back quickly, and not to leave her to this nerve-wracking solitude. 5 o'clock, 1/2 past. The hands of the clock seemed to crawl. She leaned forward and threw another log onto the fire. Then she rose and tiptoed to the window, drawing aside an edge of curtain to peer out into the gathering dusk. The woods looked eerie and haunted, and the trees towered skywards like watching giants. But there was no sign of Asher along the crooked footpath, no sign of that other man whose last searching glance still lingered in her heart, a terrifying memory. 6 o'clock. She went into the kitchen to busy herself with the supper. It would be something to do, something to occupy her thoughts. And then, as she stood there, fumbling in the darkness to find candles and matches, a crash of thunder split the silence. Barbara gave a smothered scream and dropped the matches, spilling them all over the floor. Then, with a nervous laugh, she went down on her knees, groping through the growing darkness to gather them up. A storm! This, then, was the meaning of the sudden dropping of the wind and the breathless silence. She tumbled to her feet again, her hands filled with the loose matches, and at that moment a flash of lightning lit the little kitchen and showed her with appalling clearness the outline of a man's head and shoulders against the white cotton blind of the window. The vivid flash of lightning vanished and left her once more in the darkness, the unstruck match in her hand, and her heart beating so fast with fear that she thought she would choke. The man who had knocked at the cottage door that afternoon had come back. Somehow she had known that he would do so, had been expecting him during the last dragging hours, although she had so gallantly tried to shut the thought from her heart. And for this she had only Rufus Asher to thank. Whatever happened to her tonight would be his fault alone, and she told herself passionately that he was a brute and a coward. The thunder crashed again, and with a little shudder she covered her ears with her hands. Where could she go? What could she do? She was alone in this place, miles from a living soul, with the exception of that sinister presence out there in the storm. What did he want? She dared not ask herself. She only knew that if he broke into the house, she would be powerless. She crept back to the front sitting room, still grasping the candlestick in her shaking hand. It seemed less lonely with the light and the warmth of the fire about her, but she was cold from head to foot, and the beating of her heart was like a hammer in the silence. She stood in the center of the room, her strained eyes fixed on the curtained window. Where was the man now? How soon would he try to break in? And which way would he make the attempt? Would Asher never come? What was he made of that he could leave her alone with this terror? She wished with all her soul that she had defied his threat and made her escape. It seemed now the height of folly that she had not done so, and yet she knew that he would have kept his word and shot Edmund Hyde. Edmund! And at the thought of him, the tears rose in her eyes with passionate longing. What would he say if he knew what was happening to her? She remembered the good-natured way in which he had always spoken of his brother-in-law. "He's queer, of course, but he's all right, really." He would not think so now, if he knew what she had suffered at Asher's hands during the past 5 days. A burning log fell from the grate to the open hearth, and as Barbara moved forward to pick it up with the tongs, she heard a faint, indefinable sound at the front door. She stood quite still, every nerve in her body stiffened, till she felt as if she would never be able to move again, and her face felt icy cold, as if a breath of wintry wind had passed by. The noise came again, more insistently, as if the man outside was losing patience. Barbara made a desperate effort and spoke. "Who is there?" The sound of her own voice gave her courage. The beating of her heart grew quieter. After all, perhaps there was nothing to fear. If it was only money he wanted. There was no answer to her cry, and she looked desperately round the room for some weapon with which to defend herself, but there was nothing. The tongs, the poker, they were frail and would be useless if she was ever driven to use them. Then suddenly she remembered that Asher had once told her he carried a revolver. Had he taken it with him, or was it still in his room? Fresh hope flooded her heart. She caught up the lamp and ran out of the room and upstairs to the little back room where Asher slept. She was trembling with hope and eagerness as she hurriedly searched round. His portmanteau stood empty in one corner. Some clothes were thrown untidily across the bed. One drawer in the small painted chest stood partly open, as if it was too full to shut properly. She dragged it open with impatient hands, and searched under the litter of ties and collars and handkerchiefs, but found nothing. A photograph of Linda in a small, folded leather case lay uppermost, staring at her with serious eyes, and Barbara pushed it impatiently away. Downstairs she could hear the man knocking on the door. Once above the sound of the wind and pouring rain, she thought she heard his voice. She felt desperate. She looked round the room with wild eyes. The revolver! If only she could find it! Her eyes fell on the iron bedstead behind the door. Perhaps it was under the pillow. She was across the room in a flash. She could have sobbed with relief when her fingers touched the cold steel barrel. She laughed aloud, as with it in her hand, she went back again down the narrow staircase, leaving the lamp behind her in Asher's room. It was quite dark in the passage below, save for the glow of the fire from the front room, but now she was no longer afraid, as, with the revolver clutched tightly in her hand, she moved towards the front door. "Who is there, and what do you want?" "Open the door." "I will open the door if you will tell me your name and what you want." She thought she heard a man's laugh, and then his body's heavy weight was thrust against the door. The hinges strained and creaked, but held firmly, and the voice outside said again, "Open the door, I shall break it down." And when she made no reply, a second thrust came once more, in brutal determination. She spoke as steadily as her throbbing heart would permit. "Very well, I will open it." There was a second of silence, then she pulled back the chain and the bolt. The door swung in with sudden violence, bringing with it a swirl of rain and wet leaves. She was conscious of a man's lumbering form, and hardly knowing what she did, Barbara raised the revolver and fired. And then, for a moment, she went mad. With her nerve gone completely, she flung the little shining weapon from her and screamed, hiding her face in her shaking hands. As she ran back into the firelit room, her arms raised above her head to ward off the blow she expected. "Don't hurt me! Don't hurt me!" She heard a man's steps in the room, and felt his rough hands upon her, dragging her to her feet. Then, through all her terror and panic, a voice reached her fading consciousness, a blunt, almost angry voice which she recognized with a little gasping sob of relief unbelievable. "Barbara! In God's name, what is it? What on earth has happened?" And she looked up into Asher's face. For a second she stared at him, her eyes wild with a hope to which she dared not give credence. Then, with a little hysterical cry, she flung herself against him, clinging to him, hardly conscious of what she was doing or saying. "I thought you would never come. I thought you did not mean to come back any more. And there was a man. He tried to get in. I saw him at the kitchen window. He came once this afternoon, and I was so terrified. Oh, it was cruel of you, cruel to leave me here. Don't go away again. Don't leave me any more, or I shall die. Please, please, don't leave me here." She was sobbing wildly, and shaking so that she would have fallen but for the clasp of his arm, and for some moments he let her cry. Then he put her into a chair. "There's nothing to be frightened of. There's nobody here but me. If you will let me go for a moment, I will get you something to drink." His voice was kind, but impartial. He gave in with a little shrug when Barbara still clung to his hand. Her eyes went past him fearfully to the open door, and she said again incoherently, "There was a man. I saw him, and he tried to get in. He came this afternoon first. He knew I was alone. Oh, don't let him hurt me." Asher spoke again with quiet patience. "There is nobody here to hurt you. Let me go a moment, and I will shut the door." Her eyes searched his face suspiciously. "You're not going away? You're not going to leave me again?" "On my word of honor, no." She gave a little broken laugh at that. "Your word of honor? You didn't believe in mine." But she released him, and he went back and shut and fastened the door, coming into the room again with a revolver in his hand. "Where did you find this?" "Under your pillow. I meant to kill him if he got in." He gave a short laugh. "Yes, you certainly shot to kill." He put the little weapon into his pocket. "Now, do you feel better?" "Yes." "Sit still, then, and I will get you something to eat and drink." "I don't want anything." "Don't you? Well, I do." There was no apology for her fright. He was perfectly indifferent and self-controlled. Barbara lay back in the chair and closed her eyes. Her stampeded nerves were steadier, and she began to feel ashamed of her breakdown. What a coward he must have thought her! When presently he came back with a clumsily laid supper tray, she looked at him with hot, angry eyes. "It's your fault I made such a fool of myself. I'm not generally so silly. It's all your fault, and the strain of the past week." He made no answer. He began to set the table with a man's awkwardness, and in spite of her asseveration that she was not hungry, Barbara found herself eating with something of an appetite. The rain had stopped, and everything seemed very still once more. And looking at Asher's imperturbable face in the firelight, it seemed that this day of loneliness and dread had never really been. When she rose to take the supper things away, he stopped her. "There is no need to do that yet. There is something I want you to do for me first." Words of refusal rose to her lips. She hated him for his indifference and self-possession. She began to say that she had no intention of doing anything for him again as long as she lived, when something in his face checked the words. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Asher smiled grimly. "I would not ask you, but unfortunately, I cannot do it myself." He began with difficulty to pull off his coat, which, she noticed for the first time, was sodden through and through with the heavy rainstorm. "I've got the bullet intended for your gentleman friend in my shoulder," he said whimsically. Barbara stared at him, her lips parted, her eyes wide. The bullet? In your shoulder?" she whispered. Then, as he got the coat free of his shoulder, she saw that his shirt sleeve was stained with blood. She gave a cry, but Asher said quietly, "It's nothing serious. If you will get some warm water and a clean piece of rag, we can soon repair the damage." He smiled into her pallid face. "I assure you it's nothing, Miss Weir, if you will kindly do as I ask you." "But you ought to have a doctor." He frowned impatiently. "Don't be absurd. There's no doctor for miles, and anyway, how do you imagine you could find your way to him on such a night? Besides," a gleam of mischief flashed into his somber eyes, "think what a scandal there would be if he found us here together, and I told him you had shot me." They looked at one another for a moment in silence. Then Barbara turned and walked out of the room. Mechanically she got hot water and tore some of her handkerchiefs into rags for bandages. Supposing she had killed him. Her face was colorless as she went back to the sitting room and found him standing by the fire. He had torn the shirt from his shoulder and left bare a long zigzag torn wound with ugly, sagging edges. "You see, it's nothing very much," he said as he saw her horrified eyes. "Fortunately, the bullet only grazed my shoulder. Now, do you think you can bathe it and bandage me up, or will you faint at the sight of blood?" "I'm not the fainting sort," she protested. He laughed. "No, I think you were very near this evening." The hot blood swept her face. "I know you don't believe me, but there was a man, and he did try and break into the house," she said tremulously. "I know." For a moment she felt his hand on hers. "I saw him, but he cleared off before I could do anything." Unwilling emotion filled his eyes. "If anything had happened to you," he broke off and stopped, "I should have caught that fellow and broken his neck for him, if you had not tried to kill me," he added in his usual voice. "I think you will get at me better if I sit down." Barbara knelt beside him and washed and bandaged his wound. As he had said, it was not much more than a bad graze, but it had bled a good deal, and, being in the hollow of his shoulder, was difficult to bandage. Suddenly she broke out tremulously, I might have killed you." He looked down at her careful handiwork. "Yes, if it had been an inch near my throat, there would have been a different tale to tell," he agreed coolly. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. What should I have done, and what would have been done? What should I have done, and what would have been done to me?" He laughed at the tragedy of her words. "They would not have done much to you." "What do you mean?" she asked, not understanding. "I mean that if a man deliberately kidnaps a woman and shuts her up in a place like this, he deserves all he gets, or at least that is what the law would say. They would consider that you had a perfect right to kill me." She rose to her feet. She felt that he was laughing at her. I think you are the strangest man I have ever met," she said in a resentful voice. "A man without a heart, eh?" Asher submitted dryly. "No, please leave those things alone for tonight." As she made a movement to take up the supper tray. "Please go to bed. You look like a ghost, and remember that there is no need to be frightened any more. No harm will come to you while I am here." She stood hesitating. "And your arm?" she asked. "That's nothing. I am quite all right. I would not have troubled you, only I was unable to dress it myself, and if any dirt had got in, you might have had me as a patient for some time. Good night, Miss Weir." Barbara went upstairs without answering. Her head ached violently, and her throbbing nerves felt as if they would never be still again. But one thought shone steadfastly in her mind, that after the events of today she would stand no more, and that, come what might, tomorrow she would see the end of her imprisonment. And that is the end of Chapter 5 of The Man Without a Heart by Ruby M. Ayres. Thank you for listening to this chapter with me, and I hope that you join me for many more in the future.